The excitement in the house had been building for weeks. For the young woman, this day symbolized years of hard work, countless late nights of studying, and an unwavering focus on her future. Graduation was finally here, and with it came a deep sense of accomplishment. She had worked tirelessly to achieve this goal, and now she was about to walk across the stage, diploma in hand, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Her family, too, shared in her excitement. They had watched her grow, struggle, and push herself beyond limits they had never imagined. Her father, in particular, had been her rock throughout the journey. While he was not a man of many words, his actions always spoke volumes. Whether it was picking her up late from school after a long shift at work or slipping some extra money into her wallet when he knew she needed it, his support had been constant and unwavering. She had always looked up to him, admiring his strength and resilience. But today, she wanted to make him proud. In the days leading up to the graduation, she had spoken at length with her friends about what the day would look like. They planned everything, from the outfit she would wear to the perfect Instagram photo that would capture the moment. She imagined her father in the audience, sitting proudly, his eyes filled with pride. For her, his approval meant more than anything else. She knew how much he had sacrificed for her to reach this day, and she wanted nothing more than to see him smile, knowing that everything had been worth it. As the day grew nearer, the family made plans to attend the ceremony together. Her mother prepared a special breakfast for the occasion, while her siblings planned a small celebration afterward. It was meant to be a perfect day, one that they would all remember for the rest of their lives. And while her father didn't say much about it, she could tell he was just as excited. He had asked her several times about the time of the ceremony, whether she needed anything, and what she wanted to do afterward. It was clear that in his quiet way, he was just as eager to celebrate her achievement as she was. But what she didn't know was that, in the background, her father was also facing challenges of his own. He worked long hours, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. His job was physically demanding, and there were days when he came home utterly exhausted. Yet, he never complained. He simply did what he needed to do, day in and day out, to provide for his family. Despite the long hours and tough conditions, the father took pride in his work. He believed in the importance of hard work and always told his children that nothing worthwhile ever came easy. His job, though not glamorous, was a symbol of his dedication to his family. He worked in construction, often handling heavy machinery and laboring under the hot sun or in the cold rain, depending on the season. There were days when his hands were calloused and his muscles ached from lifting, digging and hammering. But he never let it slow him down. Every day he showed up because he knew his work helped put food on the table and provided his children with opportunities he had never had. The weeks leading up to his daughter's graduation were particularly busy for him. A new project had just started, and deadlines were looming. The work was grueling, requiring long shifts and early mornings. The father would wake before the sun rose, quietly slipping out of bed so as not to disturb the rest of the family. He would grab his tools, pack a lunch, and head to the site. His days were filled with the constant hum of machinery, the sound of steel clashing against stone, and the repetitive rhythm of labor. At times, the weight of his work felt overwhelming. There were moments when his body screamed for rest, and the weariness of years spent doing back-breaking labor caught up to him. But whenever he felt like slowing down, he thought of his children, especially his daughter. He reminded himself that this was all for them, for her future. Every bead of sweat, every sore muscle was a small sacrifice for the dreams he held for his family. As the day of the graduation approached, the pressure at work only intensified. There were deadlines to meet, and his boss had made it clear that any delay could result in penalties. The father couldn't afford to lose his job, not with the family's bills piling up and his daughter preparing for her next steps in life. So, he pushed on, even when exhaustion threatened to overtake him. Despite his tiredness, the father had made it clear to his boss that nothing would stop him from attending his daughter's graduation. This was a moment he wouldn't miss for the world. However, as fate would have it, on the very morning of the graduation, an emergency arose at the worksite. A major piece of equipment had malfunctioned, and the crew was in a panic. The project was at a standstill, and without this crucial task being completed, everything could be delayed for days. The father was called upon to fix the problem. His expertise was needed, and his supervisor practically begged him to stay. Torn between his responsibility to his work and his desire to be there for his daughter, the father found himself in an agonizing situation. Every minute spent at the site was one less minute he had to get home, clean up, and make it to the ceremony. But he had no choice. He couldn't leave his team in the lurch, especially knowing how much depended on getting the job done. And so, with a heavy heart and dirty hands, he dove into the task at hand, knowing full well that the clock was ticking against him. The sun was already high in the sky when the father found himself knee-deep in the middle of a work crisis that he hadn't anticipated. It was the day of his daughter's graduation, the very moment he had been waiting for, and yet here he was, trapped in the chaos of a malfunctioning piece of equipment that seemed to be holding the entire project hostage. The machinery in question was a massive earth mover, essential to the job, and its failure had brought everything to a standstill. The site was abuzz with tension as the other workers huddled around, unsure of what to do next. The foreman was frantic. He was an old colleague of the father's, someone who respected his experience and knew his value on the team. When the equipment broke down, it was no surprise that the foreman came straight to the father. "We can't move forward without this," the foreman explained, his voice filled with urgency. "If we don't get this fixed, the entire project is going to fall behind, and you know the penalties for delays. The company's going to take a hit, and so are all of us." The father felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew the gravity of the situation. The company couldn't afford delays, and neither could he. In his line of work, there was little room for error or excuses. Jobs like these didn't come easily, and the thought of losing his position because of an equipment failure was unthinkable. Yet, at the same time, all he could think about was his daughter. The ceremony was approaching, and each passing minute felt like a ticking clock, counting down to a moment he might miss. He had been looking forward to this day for months. His daughter had always been the light of his life, and her graduation was a milestone that filled him with pride. In his heart, he had never doubted that he would be there to see her walk across that stage. He had dreamed of the moment when her name would be called, and he would be sitting in the crowd, clapping with all the other parents, his heart swelling with joy. But now, standing in the dust and dirt of the worksite, with a broken machine looming over him, that moment felt further and further away. Despite the foreman's plea, the father hesitated. His mind was racing. Should he stay and help fix the machine, knowing the consequences of leaving his team in the lurch? Or should he leave, head home, and make sure he didn't miss his daughter's big day? The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. The foreman could see the conflict in his eyes and, sensing his hesitation, spoke again, this time more softly. "I know today's important for you," the foreman said, glancing down at the ground before meeting the father's eyes again. "But we need you here. Just this once, I swear, I wouldn't ask if it weren't absolutely necessary." The father clenched his fists, his hands already calloused and worn from years of hard labor. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't make the decision any easier. His daughter would never understand why he didn't show up on time, why he couldn't be there from the very beginning. She wouldn't know about the pressure he was under, the responsibilities he shouldered every day to keep the family afloat. And even though he knew she would eventually forgive him, the thought of disappointing her, even for a moment, was like a knife to his heart. But there was no time to waste. The crew was waiting on him, and the job couldn't move forward until the machine was repaired. With a deep sigh, he nodded to the foreman and rolled up his sleeves, accepting the reality of the situation. As much as it pained him, he couldn't abandon the worksite now. Not when so much was at stake. He moved quickly, his hands deftly working over the machinery as he inspected the damage. Grease and dirt smeared across his arms and face as he delved into the heart of the problem, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze that swept through the site. Time seemed to slip away as he worked, each minute ticking by like a drumbeat in the back of his mind. The crew stood by, anxiously watching, waiting for him to perform what seemed like a miracle. The problem with the machine was more complicated than he had initially thought. A key component had broken down, and without it, the earth mover couldn't function at all. Finding a temporary fix wasn't going to be easy, but the father wasn't the kind of man to give up. He had faced worse challenges in his life, and this was just another obstacle to overcome. His mind worked quickly, running through possible solutions as he dug through the toolbox for parts. Meanwhile, the minutes continued to slip away, and with every passing moment, his anxiety grew. He couldn't stop thinking about his daughter, about how she was probably already preparing for the ceremony, putting on her graduation gown and taking pictures with her friends. He imagined her looking out into the crowd, searching for his face and not finding it. The thought made his heart ache, but he pushed it aside. There would be time for regret later. Right now, he had a job to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found a way to rig the machine so that it could at least function temporarily. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to get the project moving again. As he wiped his greasy hands on his already filthy work clothes, he looked at the foreman, who nodded gratefully. "Thanks," the foreman said, relief evident in his voice. "I don't know what we would have done without you." The father nodded, but there was no relief for him. He glanced at his watch and felt a pang of dread. The ceremony was starting soon, and he still needed to get home, clean up, and make it to the venue. Without another word, he grabbed his things and hurried off the site, leaving behind the clamor of the machinery and the dust of the job. He rushed to his truck, his heart pounding in his chest as he started the engine. He had always prided himself on his punctuality, on being there for his family no matter what, but today it felt like everything was working against him. His clothes were filthy, his face smeared with dirt, and there was no time to make himself presentable. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting to his daughter's graduation, even if it meant showing up looking like he had just crawled out of a construction pit. As he sped down the road, his mind raced. Would he make it in time? Would his daughter forgive him for being late, for not showing up the way he had planned? His heart was heavy with the weight of uncertainty. But one thing was clear. No matter what, he had to be there, even if it meant arriving dirty, exhausted, and disheveled. The road stretched out before him, each mile feeling longer than the last, and though he drove as fast as he dared, a part of him knew that he might already be too late. The father gripped the steering wheel tightly as his truck sped down the highway, his knuckles turning white under the strain. The road ahead was a blur, the trees and signs passing in a haze, but all he could focus on was the ticking of the clock on his dashboard. Time was slipping away faster than he could drive, and every second brought him closer to the unbearable possibility that he might not make it in time. His heart thudded in his chest, the weight of his responsibilities and the fear of letting his daughter down pressing down on him with unbearable intensity. He kept glancing at the clock, each glance more frantic than the last. The ceremony was set to start in less than an hour, and he was still miles away from home, covered in the grime and sweat of a long, grueling day at the construction site. His clothes were streaked with dirt, his face smeared with grease, and his hands rough and filthy from hours of labor. There was no time to go home and shower, no time to change into the clean, pressed clothes he had laid out the night before. All of that felt like a distant dream now, something he had hoped for but knew he couldn't afford. The only thing that mattered now was getting to the graduation. He could deal with his appearance later, if there was a later. As the minutes ticked by, the father's mind raced. His thoughts flickered between his daughter and the events of the day. He remembered how excited she had been for this moment, how much it meant to her. Graduation was a symbol of all the hard work and dedication she had put in over the years, and she deserved to have her family there, watching proudly from the audience. She had dreamed of this day, of seeing her father in the crowd, knowing that he was there to witness her achievement. He had promised her he wouldn't miss it, had sworn to himself that no matter what happened, he would be there. And now, with the clock working against him, that promise felt more fragile than ever. The father cursed under his breath as he hit a red light, his foot impatiently tapping against the gas pedal. The frustration boiled inside him as the seconds dragged on, the traffic around him moving at a snail's pace. He was used to the physical strain of his work, to the long hours and heavy lifting, but this was different. This was a mental and emotional strain, the kind that gnawed at his gut and filled him with a growing sense of dread. Every delay, every obstacle felt like another blow to his already dwindling hope. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection. His face was worn and haggard, the dirt and sweat accentuating the lines of exhaustion etched into his skin. His hair, usually neatly combed, was now matted and sticking to his forehead in greasy clumps. His shirt was torn in places, stained with oil and dust, and his hands were blackened from the machinery he had been working on. He looked nothing like the proud, put-together father he had imagined being on this important day. Instead, he looked like someone who had just stumbled out of a hard day's work, and that's exactly what he was. But appearances didn't matter right now. What mattered was getting to the graduation, even if he showed up looking like a mess. His daughter wouldn't care, would she? She would understand why he was late, why he hadn't had time to clean up. At least, that's what he told himself, trying to push the growing anxiety aside. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the fear that she would be disappointed, that his appearance would cast a shadow over what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life. As he finally merged onto the freeway, the father's thoughts drifted back to his daughter's childhood. He remembered the first day he dropped her off at school, how small and nervous she had been, clinging to his leg as they stood at the entrance. He had knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and promised her that everything would be okay. He had always been there for her, through every scrape and bruise, every school recital, every challenge she faced. And today, of all days, he couldn't bear the thought of not being there when she needed him most. But the day's events had conspired against him. That cursed machinery breakdown had eaten up the precious time he had set aside for this moment. And now, he was paying the price. He could still hear the foreman's voice in his head, apologizing for dragging him into the mess, but insisting they couldn't have done it without him. The father had wanted to say no, to walk away and head straight to the graduation, but how could he have left his crew stranded? He had responsibilities, obligations, and though he knew his family came first, the weight of his job had always been a close second. It was the job that kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. The job that had helped him support his daughter through her education. But in that moment, all of that felt small compared to the overwhelming need to be by her side. The freeway seemed endless, and the traffic only worsened as he neared the city. It was as if the universe itself had decided to throw every possible obstacle in his way, daring him to give up. But giving up wasn't an option, not for him. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to let something as trivial as traffic keep him from his daughter's big day. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw set in determination. He would make it, somehow. He had to. As he exited the freeway and navigated through the city streets, his heart raced faster. The venue wasn't far now, just a few more miles. He could almost picture it. The rows of proud parents seated in the audience, the students in their caps and gowns lined up, waiting for their names to be called. And somewhere in that crowd, his daughter would be looking for him, scanning the sea of faces, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man she had always looked up to. The thought filled him with both hope and dread. Would he make it in time? And if he did, would she be proud to see him? Or would she be embarrassed by the state he was in? The father's mind was so consumed with these thoughts that he barely noticed when the final red light turned green and he was finally able to pull into the parking lot of the graduation venue. He glanced at the clock once more, his heart sinking as he realized just how close he was cutting it. The ceremony had already started. He had missed the beginning, missed the speeches and the opening moments, but there was still time. He could still be there for her when she walked across that stage. That was what mattered most. He parked the truck hastily, barely taking the time to turn off the engine before he jumped out and hurried toward the entrance. His clothes were still dirty, his face still streaked with sweat and grime, but none of that mattered now. All he could think about was getting inside, finding his seat, and seeing his daughter. As he approached the doors, the sound of applause drifted out from the auditorium, and the father's heart skipped a beat. He was so close now, so close to making it in time. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the bright lights of the auditorium momentarily blinding him as his eyes adjusted to the change in lighting. The ceremony was in full swing, the graduates seated in neat rows on the stage, their faces beaming with pride. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the audience, searching for an empty seat. He was painfully aware of the stares he was receiving from the other parents, their eyes lingering on his disheveled appearance, but he didn't care. Let them stare. He hadn't come here for them. He had come here for his daughter. His eyes finally landed on her, sitting near the front of the stage, her cap and gown pristine, her face glowing with the excitement of the moment. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. Would she be ashamed of him, seeing him like this? Would she be upset that he hadn't been there from the very beginning? But then something inside him shifted. This wasn't about appearances or perfection. It was about love, about showing up, no matter the circumstances. And he had shown up. Against all odds, against the weight of the day's challenges, he had made it. With a deep breath, the father quietly found a seat near the back, his eyes never leaving his daughter. He had made it, and that was all that mattered. As the father sat down in the back of the crowded auditorium, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief mixed with anxiety. He had made it, albeit barely. The applause that filled the room echoed around him, but it felt distant, like he was in a bubble of his own tension. His hands were still trembling slightly from the rush of the drive, the dirt beneath his fingernails a visible reminder of the chaotic morning he had just endured. His shirt clung to him uncomfortably, sticky with sweat from the worksite and the stress of the situation, and though he tried to sit up straight, he felt every eye in the room could see that he didn't belong. Around him, other parents sat neatly dressed in suits, dresses, and polished shoes, their hands clasped together in anticipation, their faces glowing with pride. The stark contrast between them and him made him feel more out of place than ever. He could see them stealing glances at him, their eyes briefly flicking over his dirt-stained clothes and grease-smeared face before they quickly looked away. He didn't blame them. He probably looked like he had wandered in from the wrong event, like someone who had no business being in a place of such celebration and formality. But as much as the father was aware of his disheveled appearance, the only thing that truly mattered was his daughter. From his seat near the back, he had a clear view of her on stage, sitting with the other graduates in their caps and gowns, the tassels swaying gently as they shifted in their seats. She was right there, so close, and yet he hadn't been able to catch her eye yet. His heart ached with the desire to reach out to her, to let her know that he had made it, that he hadn't missed the moment that mattered most. The ceremony continued, and the father tried to focus on the speeches being given, the words of encouragement and congratulations echoing from the stage. A dignified speaker, probably a principal or dean, was addressing the graduates, offering them wisdom for the future and congratulating them on their hard-earned success. But the father found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept wandering back to the events of the morning, the way everything had seemed to conspire against him, pulling him away from this moment. He remembered the panic he had felt when the equipment had broken down at work, how the clock had seemed to mock him as he struggled to fix the problem. The hours had slipped away, and he had felt helpless, trapped in a situation he couldn't escape. And then, when he had finally managed to get away, the drive itself had felt like a marathon, with traffic and red lights stretching out the distance between him and the graduation. And now, here he was, sitting in the back, his clothes dirty and his hands still stained with grease, watching from a distance as his daughter prepared to receive the diploma she had worked so hard for. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized just how much he had almost missed. If things had gone differently, if the repair had taken just a little longer, or if the traffic had been just a bit worse, he might not have made it at all. The thought sent a wave of emotion through him, and he blinked back the moisture that was beginning to gather in the corners of his eyes. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The graduates were starting to line up, moving one by one toward the podium where their names would be called, their diplomas handed to them, and their futures officially set in motion. The energy in the room shifted, becoming charged with anticipation. The parents leaned forward in their seats, cameras and phones at the ready, eager to capture the moment their child's name would echo through the hall. The father's heart raced as his daughter stood up and joined the line of graduates. This was it. This was the moment he had fought so hard to make it to, the moment he had sacrificed his pride and appearance for. She was only a few steps away from the stage now, her head held high, her face glowing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The father could barely breathe as he watched her. She looked so grown up, so strong and capable, and yet, in his eyes, she was still the little girl who used to run to him with scraped knees, looking for comfort. As she approached the podium, the dean, or principal, he couldn't quite remember who, called out her name. Her full name, ringing out through the auditorium, echoing off the walls. The father's chest swelled with pride, a deep, overwhelming pride that almost made him forget about the dirt and grime clinging to him. This was his daughter, the girl he had raised, who had worked so hard, who had never given up. And now, here she was, about to walk across that stage and take the next step toward her future. The audience applauded as she crossed the stage, but to the father, the sound felt muted, distant. He was focused entirely on her, on the way her face lit up when she shook the dean's hand, on the way she clutched the diploma tightly in her hands as if it were a prize she had fought for. And it was. She smiled for the photographer as she posed with the diploma, and the father's heart skipped a beat. She looked radiant, her happiness shining through every gesture, every smile. But then, as she turned to walk off the stage and return to her seat, something unexpected happened. Her eyes scanned the audience, searching, and for a moment, the father felt a pang of fear. What if she didn't see him? What if, in the sea of parents and families, she missed him entirely? He was sitting in the back, far from where the other families had gathered, and he knew he didn't exactly blend in with the polished crowd. But then, in the middle of her scan, her eyes locked onto him. For a split second, their eyes met, and the father felt the world around him melt away. The noise of the crowd, the formalities of the ceremony, all of it faded into the background as he saw the recognition in her eyes. She had seen him. She knew he was there. The father held his breath, unsure of what her reaction would be. Would she be upset that he had missed the start? Would she be embarrassed by the way he looked, covered in the dirt and grime of his workday, sitting there like a misplaced figure in the back of the room? But then something incredible happened. His daughter smiled, a smile that was wide, genuine, and filled with love. It wasn't the awkward smile of a girl embarrassed by her father's appearance, but the smile of someone who understood. In that single moment, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the self-doubt that had been gnawing at him evaporated. She didn't care about the dirt on his clothes or the fact that he hadn't been able to clean up. All she cared about was that he was there. The father felt a lump form in his throat as he smiled back at her. It wasn't the polished, picture-perfect moment he had imagined, but it was real. It was a moment filled with love and understanding, and in that moment he knew that everything had been worth it. Every sacrifice, every hard day's work, every minute spent in traffic, it was all worth it just to see that smile on her face. As she returned to her seat, the father sat back in his chair, the tension slowly easing from his body. He had made it. He had shown up despite everything, and his daughter knew it. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur, the names and applause blending together in the background. But the father didn't care. His heart was full, and for the first time all day, he felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't just a spectator at his daughter's graduation. He was her father, and no amount of dirt or grease could take that away from him. As the daughter sat back down in her seat, diploma in hand, the initial exhilaration of the moment began to settle. The roar of applause for her classmates, the speeches from the faculty, it all started to blur together as the gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. She had done it. She was officially a graduate. The culmination of years of hard work, late nights, and moments of doubt had finally come to fruition. Yet, something in her chest felt heavy, unsettled as she scanned the crowd once more. All morning, she had tried to keep her emotions in check, telling herself that her father would be there, that nothing would stop him from showing up. He had always been the most reliable person in her life, even when work demanded every ounce of his strength. She had grown up watching him take on back-breaking jobs to provide for their family, waking up before dawn and coming home well after the sun had set. He rarely complained, and though he wasn't a man of many words, his actions had always spoken volumes. To her, he was a hero, a humble, quiet man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever asking for recognition. But today had been different. As the ceremony had started, she kept looking toward the entrance, waiting for him to appear, for his familiar figure to stride confidently into the auditorium, no matter what he looked like or how late he might be. At first, she tried not to worry. There was still plenty of time before the names would be called, and she knew that her father often had last-minute things come up at work. But as the minutes ticked by and the speakers began their opening remarks, she started to feel that knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had always prided herself on understanding her father's sacrifices. She knew how hard he worked, how much he gave up so that she and her siblings could have the opportunities he never did. But today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be the day where, for once, he didn't have to worry about work or making ends meet. Today was the day when all the sacrifices would be recognized, not just hers, but his as well. She had dreamed of seeing his face in the crowd, that look of pride she had always longed for. As the ceremony continued, she found herself distracted, unable to fully focus on the words of the speeches or the applause that followed. Every time the auditorium door opened, her head snapped toward the entrance, her heart leaping for just a moment only to fall again when it wasn't him. The feeling of disappointment began to creep in, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake it. What if something had happened? What if he wasn't able to make it? What if, after all these years of supporting her, he wouldn't be there to witness this one moment, the moment she had worked so hard for? She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself that she was being silly. Of course he would come. He had promised her. He had never broken a promise, not one that mattered. But still, as the ceremony moved forward, she couldn't ignore the growing feeling of emptiness in the pit of her stomach. When her name was finally called, she had almost forgotten to feel excited. Her mind had been so preoccupied with looking for her father that the moment itself had snuck up on her. But as she stood and walked toward the stage, clutching her diploma, she tried to refocus, to remind herself that this was her moment. Her father would be proud of her, whether he was sitting in the audience or not. She had achieved something incredible, and nothing, not even his absence, could take that away from her. As she crossed the stage, she smiled for the camera, shaking the hand of the dean and holding her diploma high. But inside, the absence of her father weighed on her like a stone. She returned to her seat, still holding out hope that somehow he would appear, that in the sea of faces she would finally spot his familiar, reassuring gaze. But as she sat down and the next name was called, that hope began to dim. It wasn't until several minutes later, after more graduates had walked across the stage, that she looked up again, and then she saw him. At first, she almost couldn't believe her eyes. Her father, standing in the back of the auditorium, looking nothing like the polished, well-dressed man she had imagined, but exactly like the man she knew. His clothes were dirty, his hands rough and stained, and his face glistened with the sweat of a man who had just come from a long day of labor. But none of that mattered. The moment she saw him, a wave of emotion surged through her, relief, joy, and something even deeper than pride. For a moment, she just stared at him, her heart racing in her chest. He was here. He had made it. And somehow, that made everything else fade into the background. The speeches, the ceremony, the worries about his appearance, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that her father had shown up, just like he always had. But then, something inside her shifted, a strange mix of emotions that she hadn't anticipated. At first, there was a flicker of embarrassment. She knew how people could be, how they might judge him for his appearance, for showing up to such a formal event, looking like he had just come from a construction site. She could almost hear the whispers of the people sitting nearby, the subtle glances they would throw his way. A part of her wished, for just a brief second, that he had been able to change, to clean up, to look like the other parents who sat in their polished shoes and ironed clothes. And then, just as quickly, that feeling dissolved, replaced by something much stronger, an overwhelming sense of pride. Not just pride in her own accomplishments, but pride in her father. Here was a man who had worked his entire life, who had sacrificed everything for his family, and who had still found a way to be there for her, even when it seemed impossible. He hadn't cared about how he looked or whether people would judge him. All he had cared about was showing up for her, being there to witness her moment, no matter the cost. Her eyes filled with tears, and she smiled, a wide, genuine smile that felt like it encompassed everything she had ever felt for him. Love, gratitude, admiration. She wanted to run up to him, to throw her arms around him, and tell him how much it meant to her that he had come, that he hadn't let anything stand in his way. But for now, all she could do was sit there and smile at him, hoping that somehow, across the distance of the auditorium, he would feel how much his presence meant to her. And in that moment, as she sat there clutching her diploma, something clicked inside her. She realized that her father's appearance, his dirty clothes, his sweat-streaked face, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had shown up, that he had always shown up, through every challenge and hardship, through every obstacle that life had thrown their way. He had been there for her, every step of the journey, even when it had cost him everything. The applause continued around her, the ceremony moved on, but for her, the world had narrowed down to this one beautiful moment. She didn't care what anyone else thought. She didn't care if people were whispering or staring. All that mattered was that her father was there, and that, to her, was everything. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, she kept glancing back at him, as if to reassure herself that he was still there, that he hadn't disappeared like some fleeting dream. And every time she saw him, standing tall, despite the exhaustion she knew he must have felt, her heart swelled with even more love and gratitude. The ceremony was supposed to be about her accomplishments, but in her eyes, this moment was as much about her father as it was about her. When the final names were called and the graduates were told to move their tassels, signaling the end of the ceremony, she stood with her classmates, but her eyes remained fixed on her father. This was it. The moment she had dreamed of for so long, the culmination of all her hard work, and he was here to witness it. The crowd erupted into applause as caps flew into the air and the graduates cheered, but all she could think about was getting to him. She clutched her diploma tightly in one hand and made her way through the sea of students and families, her heart racing as she closed the distance between them. And as she finally reached him, standing there in the back of the auditorium, dirty and tired but filled with pride, she felt the weight of everything that had come before lift from her shoulders. He had made it. He had always made it. And that was what mattered most. Without a word, she threw her arms around him, holding him tight, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you for being here, Dad. I love you." The embrace between father and daughter lasted longer than either of them had anticipated. In that moment, time seemed to slow down, and the noise of the bustling auditorium around them faded into the background. The world shrank to just the two of them, standing together amidst the chaos of celebration. His daughter's arms were wrapped tightly around him, and he could feel the depth of her emotions, the way her body shook slightly as she held onto him, as if she were afraid to let go. For him, that embrace was everything. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of unspoken love, of a bond that didn't need words to be understood. The father stood still, trying to process the flood of emotions that coursed through him. His daughter had never been a child who needed constant attention or validation, but in this moment, he realized just how much his presence meant to her. He could feel it in the way she clung to him, as if his being there, dirty clothes and all, was the only thing that mattered. He had spent years working in the shadows, providing for his family in ways that didn't always get recognized, but right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had shown up, and she knew it. As they finally pulled apart, the father looked down at his daughter, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. She was beaming up at him, her eyes red from crying, but filled with joy, love, and something else. Understanding. He hadn't expected that, hadn't realized just how deeply she understood everything he had gone through to make it to this moment. She had always been a perceptive child, wise beyond her years, but the look in her eyes now was something he had never seen before. It was a look of complete recognition, as though, in that one embrace, she had seen into his soul and understood everything he had done for her, all the sacrifices he had made without ever asking for anything in return. She wiped away her tears with the back of her hand and smiled up at him, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you'd make it," she said softly, her words simple but heavy with meaning. "I knew you would." The father nodded, swallowing hard to keep his own emotions in check. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and the weight of the day, but also filled with a quiet pride that he rarely let show. Not for anything. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the noise of the celebration around them continuing as other families embraced. Graduates posed for pictures, and the sense of accomplishment filled the air. But in that small space between father and daughter, it felt like they were in their own world. He could see how much this moment meant to her, but what surprised him even more was how much it meant to him. He hadn't realized until now just how important it was for him to be here, not just for her, but for himself. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood, the person he had worked so hard to provide for, and seeing her standing here, diploma in hand, her future wide open in front of her, filled him with a pride so intense it was almost overwhelming. His daughter seemed to sense his emotions, and she reached up to touch his arm gently. "I know you had to work today," she said quietly, her voice laced with understanding. "I can see it on you." She gestured to his dirty clothes, the grease on his hands, the streaks of dirt on his face that hadn't been fully wiped away in his rush to get to the ceremony. "But it doesn't matter. None of that matters. I'm just so glad you're here." The father blinked, his throat tightening as he listened to her words. It was as if she were giving him permission to let go of the guilt he had been carrying, the guilt that had weighed him down since he had first realized he would be late. All the worry about missing the start of the ceremony, about not being there when her name was called, about how he looked compared to the other parents, it all seemed to melt away in the face of her acceptance. She didn't care about any of that. She cared that he had come, that he had shown up when it mattered most. "I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner," he finally said, his voice low and filled with regret. "Work. There was an emergency. I couldn't leave until—" He trailed off, not knowing how to explain the complexity of his situation, how torn he had felt between his duty to his job and his desire to be there for her. But his daughter shook her head, cutting him off before he could say more. "You don't have to explain, Dad. I get it. I know how hard you work, and I know you always try to be there for me, for all of us. I've always known that." Her voice softened, and she smiled at him, that same wide, genuine smile that had lit up her face on stage. "You've never let me down, not once." Those words hit him harder than he could have anticipated. His entire life, he had carried the weight of responsibility, always feeling like he had to do more, be more, provide more. He had sacrificed so much, often feeling like it went unnoticed, but now, standing here with his daughter, he realized that she had seen it all. She had understood, even when he thought she might not. The long hours, the missed dinners, the late nights, all of it had been for her and the rest of the family. And now she was telling him that she had never doubted him. The father felt his chest tighten with emotion, but he nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Instead, he reached out and pulled her into another hug, this one even tighter than before. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her against him, and in that embrace, he let go of all the worry and guilt that had been gnawing at him. She was right. He had never let her down, and today was no different. As they stood there, the father's mind flashed back to all the moments that had led to this one. He remembered the nights when she had stayed up late studying, the mornings when he had driven her to school before heading to the job site, the moments when he had slipped a few extra dollars into her hand because he knew she needed it, but wouldn't ask. He had watched her grow up, had seen her transform from a curious little girl into a strong, determined young woman, and now she was standing here, on the cusp of a new chapter in her life, and he had been there for all of it. Finally, they pulled apart, and the father wiped at his eyes, embarrassed by the tears that had slipped out despite his best efforts to hold them back. His daughter laughed softly, her own eyes glistening with tears, and she reached up to wipe a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "You know, you might want to clean up before we take pictures," she teased lightly, her voice filled with affection. The father chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I suppose I could use a wash," he said, glancing down at his clothes. But even as he said it, he knew that it didn't matter. Not really. The dirt, the sweat, the grease. It was all part of who he was, part of the life he had built for his family. And in this moment, with his daughter smiling up at him, none of that felt like a burden. It felt like a badge of honor, a reminder of everything he had done to help her get to this point. As they stood there, side by side, the father looked around at the other families, at the graduates posing for pictures and the proud parents snapping photos with their phones. He saw the way people looked at him, saw the quick glances at his dirty clothes, but for the first time that day, he didn't care. He didn't care what they thought, didn't care if they judged him for his appearance. All that mattered was his daughter, and the knowledge that he had been there for her when it counted. Together, they walked out of the auditorium, leaving the noise and celebration behind. The father's heart was lighter now, the weight of the day's struggles lifted by the simple act of being with his daughter. As they made their way to the parking lot, his daughter looped her arm through his, leaning into him with a sense of comfort and security that made his chest swell with pride. "Are you ready for the next chapter?" he asked her, his voice soft but filled with meaning. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with excitement and a hint of nervousness. "I think so," she said, smiling, "as long as you're with me." And in that moment, the father knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the father and daughter made their way out of the bustling auditorium and into the bright sunlight of the late afternoon, the excitement of the ceremony still buzzing in the air, they were greeted by a sea of graduates and their families gathering outside for photos, hugs, and congratulations. Laughter and cheers echoed around them, the joy of achievement palpable in every corner. It was a moment of pure celebration, but for the father, the intensity of the day was just beginning to settle in. He felt a strange mix of emotions coursing through him, relief that he had made it in time, pride in his daughter's accomplishment, and a lingering sense of awe at how the day had unfolded. It wasn't the picture-perfect moment he had imagined. In his mind, he had envisioned showing up on time, freshly showered, wearing his best clothes, sitting proudly in the front row as his daughter walked across the stage. But life had taken a different course, one that left him racing against the clock, covered in dirt and scrambling to make it at all. Yet somehow, as they stood together in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, none of that seemed to matter anymore. What mattered was that he had made it. What mattered was that his daughter, despite everything, had looked at him with love and understanding, not a trace of disappointment in her eyes. What mattered was that they were here, together, sharing this milestone in a way that was deeply personal and uniquely theirs. They wandered through the crowd, greeting a few friends and exchanging congratulations with other families. His daughter beamed as she posed for photos with her classmates, laughing and joking about how they had finally made it to graduation day. The father watched from the sidelines, feeling a quiet satisfaction as he saw how happy she was, how comfortable she looked in this moment of triumph. He felt a tug in his chest, knowing that this was the beginning of a new chapter for her, one that would take her father from the life they had known together. As they walked toward the edge of the crowd, looking for a quieter spot to talk and maybe take a few photos of their own, a voice suddenly cut through the noise, calling out his daughter's name. The father turned, surprised to see one of the graduates stepping up to the microphone at the front of the courtyard, where a small podium had been set up for post-ceremony announcements. The young man, still dressed in his cap and gown, stood tall and confident, his voice clear and commanding. It was obvious that he was someone important, maybe the class president or valedictorian. He had the kind of presence that made people stop and listen. "Before we wrap up today's celebration," the young man began, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone who, I believe, embodies what today is truly about. Someone who represents not only hard work and determination, but the kind of quiet strength that often goes unnoticed, yet has the power to change lives." The father's brow furrowed as he watched the young man speak. He didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way the graduate was looking out over the crowd, something in his tone that made the father feel as if he was speaking directly to him. A strange sense of anticipation began to build in the father's chest, though he couldn't quite explain why. The crowd had quieted down, curious about what the young man was going to say. His daughter, standing beside him, seemed just as confused, glancing up at her father with a question in her eyes. But before she could say anything, the young man continued, "I'm talking about a father who worked harder than anyone else in this crowd could possibly imagine. A man who spent years giving everything he had for his family, who sacrificed day after day to ensure his children could have the opportunities he never had. And today, despite the challenges and demands of his life, he showed up. He made it here, not for himself, but for his daughter." The father felt his breath catch in his throat. Was the young man talking about him? He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if someone else might step forward, but no one did. The crowd had gone silent, all eyes now on the young man at the microphone. The father felt the weight of their attention, his heart beginning to pound in his chest as the realization slowly dawned on him. "I've seen this man before," the young man continued, his voice steady and filled with admiration. "I've seen him around town, working long hours, always with a quiet, determined look on his face. He's not someone who asks for recognition, but today I think it's important that we recognize what he's done, not just for his daughter, but for all of us who have been lucky enough to witness his example." The father stood frozen, his mind racing. How could this young man know him? How could he know the sacrifices he had made, the struggles he had faced to get here today? He had always kept his head down, working without complaint, never expecting anyone to notice the long hours or the toll it took on him. And yet, here was this young man, standing before a crowd of hundreds, speaking as if he understood everything the father had been through. Beside him, his daughter turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently, as if to reassure him that this moment was real. The father's throat tightened, and for a moment he thought he might have to sit down. The emotions swirling inside him were too intense, too overwhelming to process all at once. "And now," the young man said, his voice growing even more solemn, "I'd like to invite that father to come forward. Sir, wherever you are, please join us up here. We'd like to honor you." The crowd turned, scanning the area, looking for the man the young graduate had been speaking about. The father's pulse raced as he realized there was no escaping this moment. It was him. He was the father the young man was talking about. For a brief moment, the father hesitated, unsure if he could step into the spotlight, unsure if he even deserved the praise that was being heaped upon him. He had simply done what any father would have done: worked hard, provided for his family, and shown up for his daughter when it mattered most. He had never thought of himself as someone worthy of recognition, certainly not in front of an audience of strangers. But as he stood there, feeling the weight of his daughter's hand in his, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about him. It was about her. It was about everything they had been through together, about the bond they had built, and about the future they were stepping into. With a deep breath, the father nodded to his daughter and slowly began to walk toward the front of the courtyard. The crowd parted as he made his way forward, their eyes filled with curiosity and admiration. As he reached the podium, the young man smiled warmly and gestured for him to come up onto the small stage. The father hesitated for a moment, but then, with his heart pounding in his chest, he climbed the steps and stood beside the young man. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the crowd watching expectantly. The father could feel the eyes of the entire audience on him, and though he was used to being unnoticed, to blending into the background, there was something deeply humbling about being seen, really seen, for the first time. The young man turned to the crowd and spoke again, his voice filled with respect. "This is what today is about," he said, gesturing toward the father. "It's about the people who show up, who give everything they have without expecting anything in return. It's about love, sacrifice, and the bonds that hold us together. And this man, this father, is the embodiment of that." The applause that erupted from the crowd was deafening. The father stood there, his head spinning, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, to being the center of anything, let alone a moment like this. But as he stood there, looking out over the sea of faces, he saw his daughter in the front row, her eyes shining with tears, and he knew that this moment, this recognition, wasn't just for him. It was for her, for their family, for everything they had overcome together. The young man reached out and shook the father's hand, his grip firm and sincere. "Thank you," the young man said softly. His voice meant only for the father's ears. "Thank you for showing us what it means to be truly dedicated." The father, his voice thick with emotion, nodded in response. "I didn't do anything special," he muttered, still trying to wrap his mind around what was happening. But the young man shook his head, his smile unwavering. "That's exactly why it's special," he said, "because you didn't have to be here today, but you are." And with that, the father stepped back from the podium, the applause still echoing in his ears, and returned to his daughter's side. The weight of the day felt lighter now, not because the burden of responsibility had lifted, but because, for the first time, he felt truly seen. Not just as a provider or a worker, but as a father who had always shown up. As the father stepped down from the stage, his heart still pounding from the unexpected honor he had just received, he felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest, a release of something he hadn't realized he'd been holding onto for so long. The applause from the crowd continued to ripple through the courtyard, gradually fading as the moment passed. But inside him, something had changed. He had spent his life in the shadows, content to work quietly, to sacrifice without recognition, believing that his role as a father was one of silent service. Yet, standing on that stage, hearing the young man's words of admiration and gratitude had stirred something deep within him, an understanding that his presence, his effort, mattered more than he had ever allowed himself to believe. As he walked back toward his daughter, the crowd parting to make way for him, he could see her waiting for him with a smile that was equal parts pride and joy. Her eyes sparkled with the tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away, and when he reached her, she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she just stood there, looking at him, as if seeing him in a new light, as if the man she had always known had somehow transformed in front of her eyes. But the truth was, he hadn't changed. He was the same man he had always been, the father who worked tirelessly, who rarely complained, who showed his love through action rather than words. What had changed was how the world saw him, and perhaps how she saw him too. Without a word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him once again, holding him tight. This time, the hug felt different. There was no rush, no urgency, no fear of missed moments. This was a hug of recognition, of understanding. It was as if, in that embrace, she was telling him that she saw him, truly saw him, not just as her father, but as a man who had quietly carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for her sake. And in that moment, the father felt something shift in himself as well. He had always known his daughter loved him, had always known she appreciated what he did for her. But now, standing here in the warmth of her embrace, he realized she understood the depth of his sacrifices in a way she never had before. When they finally pulled apart, her eyes searched his face, and she smiled through her tears. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of celebration. "I don't think I've ever said that to you, but I am. I'm proud of everything you've done for me, for us." The father felt his chest tighten, overwhelmed by the unexpected emotion her words brought out in him. He had spent his whole life working for his family, but he had never sought their approval or recognition. It wasn't why he did it. He had always believed that his duty as a father was to provide, to make sure his children had what they needed, regardless of whether or not they ever acknowledged the sacrifices he made. But hearing his daughter say those words he never expected to hear, felt like a balm to his soul, soothing the weariness he had carried for years. "I've always just done what I had to do," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't need anyone to notice." His daughter shook her head, her expression soft but serious. "But we did notice, Dad. I noticed. Even when I didn't say anything, I always knew how hard you worked. I always knew you were doing it for us. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." The father stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filling with a tenderness that he rarely allowed to show. "You never needed to say anything," he said, his voice thick. "You've always made me proud just by being you. Watching you today, seeing what you've accomplished, it makes everything I've done worth it. You're the reason I've worked so hard." His daughter blinked, her eyes shimmering with fresh tears. She looked down at her diploma, then back at him, and smiled. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said. "Everything I am, everything I've accomplished, it's because of you." The father felt a lump form in his throat, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation. He had never been the type to share his feelings openly, and hearing his daughter express such deep gratitude made him feel both proud and a little uncomfortable. But there was no denying the truth of her words. He had been there for her every step of the way, even when it meant sacrificing his own comfort and well-being. And now, standing here in the aftermath of her graduation, he realized just how much it had all meant, not just to her, but to him as well. They stood together in silence for a few moments, the weight of the day settling around them like a warm blanket. The father glanced around at the other families, seeing the joy and celebration in their faces, and felt a quiet contentment wash over him. It wasn't the kind of contentment that came from recognition or accolades, but from knowing that he had done his job as a father. He had shown up for his daughter, not just today, but every day of her life. And in the end, that was what mattered most. As the crowd around them began to thin, the graduates and their families slowly making their way to cars and after-parties, his daughter turned to him again, her face still glowing with the joy of the day. "Dad, can we take a picture?" she asked, pulling out her phone with a grin. "I want to remember this moment." The father hesitated for a second, glancing down at his clothes. He was still covered in dirt and grime from the workday, his hands rough and stained from hours spent fixing the machinery that had delayed him earlier. He didn't look like the other parents, who were dressed in their finest clothes, smiling proudly in their polished shoes and clean shirts. But as he looked at his daughter's hopeful face, he realized that none of that mattered. This was their moment, and it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, of course," he said, standing up a little straighter. "Let's take a picture." His daughter beamed and quickly positioned them in front of the school's backdrop, the name of the university proudly displayed in bold letters behind them. She held the phone out in front of them, her arm around his waist as she leaned in close. The father stood tall beside her, feeling an unexpected surge of pride as he looked at the camera. He didn't care about the dirt on his clothes or the sweat still clinging to his skin. What mattered was that he was here, standing next to his daughter, celebrating her achievement in the most authentic way possible. As the camera clicked, capturing the moment in digital permanence, the father felt a sense of peace settle over him. This picture, this moment, wasn't just a snapshot of a graduation day. It was a symbol of everything they had been through together, of the long road they had traveled as father and daughter. It was a testament to the sacrifices he had made and the love they shared, a love that didn't need words or grand gestures to be felt. When the picture was done, his daughter turned the phone around to show him. There they were, side by side, her in her cap and gown, him in his dirty work clothes, both smiling like they had won the lottery. The father chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well," he said, "I don't think I'll be winning any best-dressed awards." His daughter laughed, nudging him playfully with her elbow. "I don't care about that," she said. "This picture is perfect, just the way it is." The father looked at the photo again, feeling the weight of her words. Perfect. Not because everything had gone according to plan, but because it hadn't. It was perfect because it was real, because it captured who they were. Flawed, hard-working, and deeply connected. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the courtyard, the father and daughter walked toward the parking lot together. The day had been long, filled with unexpected twists and turns, but in the end, it had turned out better than either of them could have imagined. They had shared something more valuable than a simple graduation ceremony. They had shared a moment of recognition, of gratitude, of love. And as they walked together, the father realized that this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where his daughter would go off into the world, taking with her the lessons he had taught her, the strength he had shown her, and the love that had bound them together through every challenge. He had been there for her every step of the way, and he knew, without a doubt, that she would carry him with her, no matter where life took her next. With one last glance at the picture on her phone, the father smiled, feeling a sense of pride and peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. This was what it meant to be a father. This was what it meant to love unconditionally, to give without expecting anything in return, and to show up, even when it wasn't easy. As they reached the car, his daughter turned to him, her smile soft and full of meaning. "Thanks for everything, Dad," she said quietly, her voice filled with the weight of all the unsaid things between them. The father smiled back, his heart full. "You're welcome," he said simply. "Always." As the father and daughter walked together toward the parking lot, the day's events still swirling in their minds, the warmth of the setting sun cast a golden hue over the world around them. It was the kind of evening that felt timeless, the kind of moment that seemed to stretch on infinitely, where every detail became etched into memory. For the father, this day would be one he would carry with him forever, not just as the day his daughter graduated, but as the day they both truly recognized the depth of their bond, their connection forged through years of shared sacrifice and love. The father glanced down at his daughter, seeing her now not as the little girl who had once clung to him for support, but as the young woman she had become, strong, independent, and ready to take on the world. There was a bittersweetness in the realization, a mixture of pride and the ache of knowing that this was the beginning of her stepping out into a life of her own. She had always been his little girl, but now, standing tall beside him, her cap in hand and diploma tucked under her arm, she was something more. She was an adult, a person who had grown through her own hard work, her own choices, but always with the steady presence of her father guiding her. They reached the car, and for a moment, the father hesitated before unlocking it. He wasn't ready for this day to end. There was something sacred about the time they were sharing now, in the soft glow of the evening, away from the crowds and celebrations. He wanted to savor it, to hold on to the feeling that, for just a little while longer, it was still just the two of them against the world. His daughter seemed to sense this. She turned to him, her face softened by the waning light, and leaned against the car, letting the weight of the day settle. "I can't believe it's all over," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and nostalgia. "All these years, and it's done. Just like that." The father smiled gently, nodding. "It feels like it went by fast, doesn't it? 1 minute you're starting school, and the next, you're graduating." She laughed softly, a sound that brought him comfort, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "Yeah, but at the same time, it felt like forever. I mean, all those late nights studying, all the exams. It didn't always feel like it was going by fast then." The father chuckled, remembering the nights when she had stayed up late, books and papers spread out across the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to master some complex subject. He had always been in awe of her dedication, the way she threw herself into everything with such determination, even when it seemed overwhelming. And through it all, he had been there, sometimes just in the background, but always present, ready to support her in whatever way he could. "You've worked hard for this," he said softly, his voice full of pride. "You earned it. Every bit of it." His daughter looked up at him, her eyes glistening once again, but this time there was a depth to her gaze that went beyond the day's achievements. She seemed to be looking into him, seeing him not just as her father, but as the man behind all the sacrifices, the quiet efforts, and the countless moments of support. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never could have done it without you." The father felt his throat tighten, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he had expected. He had always known that he played a role in her success, but to hear her acknowledge it so directly, so sincerely, filled him with a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any recognition he had ever sought. This was the validation he hadn't realized he needed, not from the world, but from her, from his daughter. "I didn't do much," he said, though his voice betrayed the emotion he was feeling. "I just did what any father would do. I just wanted to make sure you had what you needed." She shook her head, stepping closer to him, her hand resting on his arm. "No, Dad. You did more than that. You gave me everything. You gave me a life where I could focus on my dreams, where I didn't have to worry about anything except being the best version of myself. You worked so hard, and I know it wasn't always easy, but you never let it show. You were always there for me. Always." The father looked into her eyes, the sincerity of her words cutting through him like a knife, but in the best possible way. He had never asked for thanks, had never needed her to recognize the sacrifices he had made. But standing here, in this moment, hearing her say those things, he realized just how much it meant to him. He hadn't just been a provider, he had been a father, a good father, and that, more than anything, was his greatest accomplishment. "I couldn't be prouder of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Watching you grow up, seeing the person you've become, it's the greatest thing I've ever been a part of. You've made all the hard work worth it." Tears brimmed in her eyes again, but this time she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, her smile unwavering. "I'm going to miss this," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I'm going to miss having you right there whenever I need you." The father's heart clenched at her words, the reality of the moment sinking in. This was a turning point, not just for her, but for both of them. She was about to step into a world of independence, a world where he wouldn't always be by her side to guide her or catch her when she stumbled. And while he knew she was ready, the thought of letting her go, of watching her take those steps without him, filled him with a mix of pride and sorrow. "You'll never have to miss me," he said gently, reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from her face. "I'll always be here, no matter where you go. I'll always be there when you need me. That's what being a father means. I'll always show up for you." She nodded, biting her lip as she looked up at him, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "I know you will," she whispered, her voice full of certainty. "You always have." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them letting the weight of the conversation settle. There was no rush now, no need to move on from this moment too quickly. The father felt the warmth of the evening air on his skin, the gentle breeze carrying with it a sense of calm that seemed to mirror the peace he felt in his heart. This day had been about more than a graduation. It had been a moment of recognition, of understanding between them that went beyond words or gestures. It was the culmination of a lifetime of love and sacrifice, distilled into this one perfect moment. Eventually, his daughter broke the silence, her voice lighter now, though still filled with affection. "So," she said with a playful grin, "what's next, Dad? I mean, we can't just stand here all night." The father laughed, feeling the tension of the day finally melt away. "I suppose not," he said, smiling down at her. "What do you want to do? This is your day. You call the shots." She thought for a moment, her eyes glancing around at the remnants of the graduation celebration still happening in the distance. "Honestly," she said, her tone turning serious again, "I just want to spend time with you. Maybe we could grab some dinner, just the two of us. I don't want this day to end yet." The father's heart swelled with affection, and he nodded. "That sounds perfect," he said. "Let's go." They climbed into the car, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence as they pulled out of the parking lot and headed down the road. The father felt a sense of peace settle over him, knowing that while this chapter of their lives was coming to an end, a new one was just beginning. His daughter had grown into the person he had always known she could be, strong, smart, and capable of handling whatever life threw her way. And though the road ahead would be different, perhaps more distant than the one they had traveled together so far. He knew that their bond would remain unshakable. As they drove into the evening, the sky turning shades of pink and orange, the father glanced over at his daughter, her face illuminated by the fading light. She was looking out the window, her expression thoughtful but content, and he couldn't help but smile. This was their moment, a quiet celebration of everything they had shared and everything that was yet to come. And as they continued down the road, the father knew with absolute certainty that no matter what the future held, he would always show up for her. He would always be there, in whatever way she needed, ready to support her, to love her, and to watch her soar. Because that was what it meant to be a father. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about the quiet, steady presence, the unwavering love that endured through every challenge, every triumph, and every change. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft golden glow, the father realized that this simple drive with his daughter beside him was the greatest gift he could ever have. The gift of knowing that he had been the father she needed and that he always would be.